They told us paper was just for writing. They didn't tell us it was for building. Welcome back to the archives of the pivot paper. I've got a story for you today about a woman who had to redraw her own map. It is the winter of 2015. Outside, the world is moving with a frantic digital hunger, but inside this library, the only sound is the rhythmic, patient pulse of the grandfather clock in the corner. Vivian was 45 that year. She was a woman who took pride in the tuck-away. Every month for 2 decades, she had performed the ritual of the responsible. She would take a portion of her salary, earned through the long, invisible hours of middle management, and she would move it into a savings account. She liked the way the numbers looked on the screen. It felt like a fortress. She was taught, as many of us were, that a black woman's safety is measured by the thickness of her mattress or the balance in her Chase account. But 2015 was a year of reckoning. Vivian sat at her mahogany desk, the scent of beeswax and Earl Grey tea hanging in the air. She held a fountain pen, a heavy silver instrument that felt like an anchor in her hand. She began to do the math. Not the math the bank wanted her to do, but the forensic math of a woman who was tired of being tired. She realized that her fortress was actually a gilded cage. Inflation was a quiet thief slipping through the cracks of her front door every night, nibbling away at the edges of her purchasing power. While Vivian was sleeping, the dollars she had worked so hard to save were losing their breath. She had $100,000 in that account, a point of pride, a legacy of discipline. But as she looked out at the neighborhood, she saw the cranes, she saw the new developments, she saw the prices of the things she actually needed: healthcare, land, sovereignty, climbing a ladder she couldn't reach. She was saving currency while the world was trading in assets. The bank was paying her a fraction of a percent for the privilege of using her life's blood to fund their own expansion. They were taking her security and turning it into their dominion. It was the great erasure. A woman like Vivian could work for 40 years, save every penny, and still end up a guest in a world she helped build because she owned nothing that produced while she slept. She felt the coldness of the marble counter in her mind. She saw the faces of the women who came before her, women who saved their pennies in jars, only to have the jars broken by the whims of a fluctuating economy. She realized that saving is a strategy of defense, and you cannot win a war if you never take the field. Vivian looked at her bank statement, the ink dark and mocking. She realized that she wasn't building a legacy, she was just funding a funeral for her own potential. The bank sent her a toaster for her loyalty, while they used her capital to buy the neighborhood. She put the cap back on her fountain pen. The click echoed in the silent library. The crisis wasn't that she lacked currency. The crisis was that she lacked a ledger that spoke her name. She decided then, under the soft glow of the library lamp, that she was done being a creditor. She was going to become an owner. To be continued. In Part 2, we explore the moment the ledger turned from a list of debts into a map of power. The laptop on Vivian's mahogany desk hummed. A low mechanical vibration that felt out of place in the stillness of her library. It was 2015, and the digital age was no longer a suggestion. It was an ultimatum. She adjusted her reading glasses, the weight of the frames familiar and grounding. Before her lay the forensic audit of her own life. Most people look at a bank statement and see a balance. Vivian began to look at it and see a leak. She took a yellow highlighter, the felt tip squeaking softly against the grain of the paper, and began to mark every line where her money sat still. The yellow streaks looked like caution tape. Caution, stagnant capital. Caution, eroding purchasing power. She realized then that her loyalty to the savings account was a one-sided romance. She was providing the bank with the liquidity they needed to lend to developers, to fund startups, and to buy the very blocks she walked past every day. In exchange, they gave her a digital number that grew by pennies. The betrayal wasn't loud. It didn't arrive with a crash or a cry. It arrived in the silence of the math. She didn't need a higher salary. She needed a lower dependency on her own heartbeat. That was the pivot. The realization that as long as her wealth was tied to her labor, she was merely a high-functioning tenant in her own existence. To become the architect, she had to stop being a creditor to the bank and start being an owner of the infrastructure. She began the technical pivot, a transition from income-focused living to asset-driven sovereignty. In the archives of 2015, this was a radical quietude. While others were chasing the next hustle, Vivian was studying the architecture of the dividend and the deed. She looked at her $100,000. In a savings account, it was a liability dressed in a tuxedo. It cost her the opportunity of growth every single hour it sat there. She decided to reallocate. She didn't spend the money. She deployed it. She began to look for cash-flowing assets, entities that had a life of their own, independent of her presence. She looked at dividend-producing equities, companies that paid her a rent simply for owning a piece of their future. She looked at the local real estate market not for a home to live in, but for a door that would collect a check. She was moving from the invisible labor of saving to the visible authority of ownership. She remembered the scent of the old library books as she studied the tax codes of 2015. She saw the key to the kingdom hidden in plain sight. The tax system in this country is designed for the owner, not the earner. By moving her capital from a savings account into an LLC-structured asset, she wasn't just growing her money, she was shielding it. She was building a vault that the quiet thieves of inflation and taxation couldn't easily pick. It was a cold Tuesday when she made the first transfer. The click of the mouse felt heavier than the stroke of a pen. She moved the first $25,000 out of the safety of the savings account and into a brokerage account focused on dividend growth. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a rhythmic, soulful reminder that she was breaking a generational spell. She was taught to hold on tight. The asset architect knows you must learn when to let go so the seed can find the soil. She watched the confirmation screen flicker. For the first time in her life, she didn't just have money, she had a machine. A machine that would work while she slept. A machine that didn't care if she was tired, or if she was caregiving for her mother, or if she decided to never sit at that mahogany desk again. But ownership is not a destination, it is a discipline. And Vivian was about to learn that when you change the name on the ledger, the world starts to look at you differently. The shift from Vivian the employee to Vivian the asset manager required a new set of papers. To be continued. In Part 3, we examine the legal reckoning and the moment Vivian realized that to protect her assets, she had to disappear behind a trust. The atmosphere in the study had shifted by the spring of 2015. The rain was no longer a gentle tapping on the window. It was a persistent, heavy downpour that turned the garden into a blurred watercolor of gray and green. Vivian sat at her desk, but she was no longer looking at bank statements. She was looking at a trust binder. It was bound in heavy midnight blue leather, the weight of it pressing down on the mahogany surface like an anchor. Inside were the documents that would finalize the exorcism of her old financial life. To the world, Vivian was a single woman with a decent job and a healthy savings account. To the state, she was a target for probate, a subject for taxation, and a vulnerable entry on a public ledger. She realized that as long as her assets were held in her own name, Vivian, she was carrying the full weight of the liability on her own shoulders. If she stumbled, the assets fell with her. She needed to disappear. Not in a way that was illicit or suspicious, but in a way that was institutional. She needed to move from the fragile I to the enduring it. She picked up her fountain pen. The ink inside was a custom shade of black, dense, archival, and permanent. She began the process of retitling her life. She was no longer just Vivian. She was the grantor. She was the trustee. She was the architect of a private kingdom that the public would never be invited to tour. The name on the ledger changed from Vivian to the Vivian Trust, and suddenly the IRS had a much quieter conversation with her. She moved the deed to her property. She moved the brokerage accounts she had seeded in the winter. She moved the beneficiary designations on her insurance policies. One by one, the visible Vivian was being erased from the ledgers of the state and replaced by a structured entity. This was the paper trail of power. She felt the coldness of a heavy brass wax seal as she pressed it into a pool of molten red wax at the bottom of a signature page. The scent of burning wick and honey filled the room. It was a tactile reclamation. She was performing a forensic audit of her own legacy. She looked back at the years she spent saving and saw them for what they were, a lack of structure. A savings account is a request for permission. An asset held in a trust is a declaration of authority. In 2015, the world was obsessed with transparency, but Vivian was obsessed with fortification. She understood that for a Black woman in America, privacy is a form of protection that money cannot always buy, but paper can. She spent 3 days reviewing the Schedule A of her trust. It was a list of her newly acquired machines, the dividend stocks that were already beginning to drop small, rhythmic deposits into her account, the equity in a small multi-family unit she had purchased in a quiet neighborhood, the private equity stake in a friend's growing consulting firm. She was no longer trading her hours for dollars. She was trading her capital for the hours of others. The exorcism was complete when she closed her primary savings account. She stood in the bank, that marble temple of stagnant cash, and watched the teller's face as she requested the closure. The teller looked at her with a mix of confusion and pity, as if Vivian were making a terrible mistake. "You're losing your premier status," the teller whispered. Vivian didn't smile. She didn't explain. She simply took the cashier's check, the final remains of her safety net, and walked out into the rain. She wasn't a premier customer anymore. She was a sovereign. She drove home and sat in her library, the ticking of the clock now sounding like a heartbeat rather than a countdown. She opened the trust binder one last time and placed the check inside. The great erasure was over. The legacy restoration had begun. But there was one final document she hadn't signed yet, the document that would ensure that even if she weren't there to turn the key, the machines would never stop humming. To be continued. In Part 4, we witness the final legacy and the moment the architect steps into the light of her own design. The year 2015 was not merely the year Vivian changed her bank account. It was the year she changed her bloodline. The garden in late autumn has a specific kind of dignity. The vibrance of summer has faded, replaced by the structural strength of the trees, the parts that remain when the leaves are stripped away. Vivian stood at the iron gate of her garden, her hand resting on the cool metal. On her finger, a heavy silver ring caught the dying light of the golden hour. She was no longer looking back at the what-ifs of her career. She was looking at a landscape she owned. The transition from saver to owner is a quiet one, but its echoes are deafening. In her library, the trust binder sat, finished. It contained the blueprints for a life that would outlive her. She had established the digital vault, a repository of passwords, deeds, and instructions that ensured her daughter wouldn't have to go on a scavenger hunt for her mother's worth. She had moved beyond the great erasure. Every quarter, the machines she had set in motion in the winter of 2015 delivered their tribute. Dividends from the company she owned a piece of, rent from the doors she had acquired, equity that grew while she drank her tea and read her books. She was no longer a guest in the economy, she was a landlord of her own destiny. She realized that the greatest asset she had purchased wasn't the stocks or the real estate, it was her time. She had bought back her mornings. She had bought back her ability to say no without checking a balance. The savings trap is a game of survival. Asset ownership is a game of sovereignty. Vivian looked at her daughter, who was sitting on the porch steps, unaware that the paper trail her mother had laid down would be the bridge she walked across into her own adulthood. The girl wouldn't have to start from zero. She wouldn't have to learn the hard lesson that currency is a melting ice cube. She would inherit a ledger that spoke of authority, not just effort. That is the true definition of a matriarch. It isn't just about the money you leave. It is about the structure you build to protect it. It is about the paper that ensures the power stays within the walls you've raised. Vivian turned away from the gate and walked back toward the house. The shadows were long, but she didn't fear the dark. She had built her own light. She had stopped saving for a rainy day and started building a roof that would never leak. The archives of 2015 show us that the pivot is rarely loud. It is a series of small, precise movements, a signature here, a transfer there, a refusal to be satisfied with the crumbs of a savings interest rate. It is the moment you realize that the most important building you will ever design is the one that houses your freedom. It's time to stop being a guest in your own life and start being the architect. Sign your own pivot. Subscribe to the paper. Legacy is not what we leave behind. It is what we put in place. You have heard the story. You have seen the pivot. Now the drafting table is yours. If you are ready to move from equitable interest to legal sovereignty, join us in the vault. Secure the paper. Protect the lineage. I am the asset architect, and this is the pivot paper.